In the beginning was the sun. The very earliest films were exposed in sunlight. The reason was simple. The sun was the only conceivable light source. In the absence of powerful lamps, and using film which required a great deal of light, filmmakers were forced to expose their film in direct sunlight. But technical development was very rapid, and soon cinema cameramen began to use quite advanced tricks to preserve and strengthen the light. The development of lighting techniques largely followed various technical improvements, but the decisive factor was the filmmaker's discovery of light as a narrative element. Lighting could strengthen an emotion, build up a character, and guide a narrative in a particular direction. In the U.S., pioneering filmmakers worked on the rooftops of Philadelphia and New York. Normal theater scenery was used in the acting areas, and the film was always shot from directly in front of the set, making sure that the sun was always behind the camera. Feature films became big, but effective shooting days were shortened by the fact that cameramen were dependent on the position of the sun, so it was difficult to meet public demand for more and longer films. To extend the length of the shooting day, rails were constructed to enable the whole set to be turned as the sun moved. Now filmmakers could work more than twice as long each day, still with the sun at their backs. The sensitivity to light in use improved over time, and very soon it was possible to build specialized film studios. The studios were fitted with huge skylights, since filming was dependent to a great extent on daylight. The method of filming was exactly the same as on the New York rooftops, with the camera still placed directly in front, and the action played out on an ordinary theater set. In 1910, electric light was used for the first time. Initially, they used only to supplement natural light, since the sun was still the dominant light source. At this period, lights were rigged overhead and used to separate people and areas. This enabled greater use to be made of the sharp contrasts of black and white film. The largest part of the film industry soon moved to Hollywood in California. At first, the move met with some resistance. The region was sparsely populated and to filmmakers from New York. But the many advantages soon became obvious. The space available was very useful, there were considerably more days of sunlight, and they finally had undisturbed conditions. Huge sets, sometimes even whole towns, were built out of doors. Even where indoor scenes were required, the sun was still the light source, and complete house interiors were sometimes erected outside the studio. In spite of the advantages of having more hours of sunlight and more space, the use of electric lighting continued to develop. Artificial lighting became more and more common as a means of creating mood. To begin with, directed theater lighting was used, but reflective screens also came into use to fill in and soften shadows. Indirect lighting using reflective screens provided another technique, and the industry was approaching which became the norm throughout the history of film and television. At the beginning of the second decade of the 20th century, European filmmakers produced huge and very spectacular historical dramas. Italy was a leader with gigantic films, especially set in the Roman period. The Italians were wise enough to use their preserved historic buildings instead of constructing sets. The results were highly successful, and Hollywood was naturally unable to compete. Hollywood's answer was the vamp film, which showed sparsely clad women in exotic locations. These films were incredibly melodramatic and also very popular. The vamp soon became a household word, and Theda Bara was the great star. The vamps laid the foundations for the star system, which still characterizes Hollywood. Backlighting was then introduced. A light was aimed towards the camera. The purpose of backlighting was to bring the star forward out of the background towards the audience, and naturally to make the picture even more beautiful. When the major part of the work of filming moved inside the studios, it became much more economical, since it was now independent of sunshine, weather, and wind. Sunlight was replaced by a directed electric key light, and with indirect lighting to fill in the shadows and the introduction of backlighting, the techniques of lighting were set, and the normal pattern right into the 1950s, three-point lighting. Lighting for television was naturally much influenced by methods developed for films. Of course, there were major differences. Almost immediately, television began to work with multi-camera techniques, which meant that the lighting had to work from various angles in one and the same picture. This made the lighting less deep and gave television pictures a tendency to become flat and boring. But what seems at first to be a drawback and a compromise sometimes transforms itself into a style. The cinema began to adopt and then above all to improve on the television style. This led in turn to an improvement in lighting for television. This interaction continues today, and both media constantly cross-fertilize each other.